host of co-host of Israel News Talk Radio, Beyond the Matrix. I'm here with Dan, who is director of the program to counter political warfare at the Jersualem Center for Public Affairs. And thanks for making time available in a hectic travel schedule that you have.
Good to be here.
Okay. Let's go deal with a whole bunch of issues related to current political warfare against the state of Israel. Some of that was kicked off by a human rights report that came out that basically accused Israel of crimes against humanity and apartheid and persecution. Why did the Human Rights Watch release this report at this time?
Well, Jerry, Human Rights Watch is releasing a really damning report, but unfortunately the report is based on falsehoods, fiction, and fantasy. It has had a tradition of politicizing its research specifically against Israel. You know, the charge of apartheid isn't a normal charge. It's one of the two most heinous crimes against humanity of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Of course, Nazism being the first and apartheid being the second. And it has not called, in all of its so-called human rights work, some of which has been important work against, evil regimes like North Korea, and some of what is happening in Syria and under Saddam Hussein. But what they have never done, other than in the Israeli case, is to charge the worst terror-supporting and human rights violating regimes in the world with the charge of apartheid. That they've reserved only for the one liberal democracy in the Middle East region, that is the state of Israel. So, for them to use this type of language against the one country that guarantees equality, freedom for all of its citizens, including the nearly 2,000 Israeli citizens of Arab, mostly Muslim descent, is simply absurd on a good day, and absolutely, I would even call it a racist report, on a bad day. And I think that's where we are today. I think that Human Rights Watch should be defunded, and it should be completely delegitimized over this report. Let's just bear in mind just two more points here. Just bear in mind there are 10 countries in the world that are engaging in modern slavery, beginning with Iran and Afghanistan, and into some of the African countries, and of course, the worst human rights violators such as China, that is systematically torturing its Uyghur minority and worse. You don't see any of these charges of apartheid, only when it comes to Israel, and in fact, when it comes to Israel, only really in the context of a political terror problem that Israel has with the Hamas and the PLO leadership. So there's no context. It's poorly researched. It's completely politically charged, and I think they should pay a high price for this.
What was the reaction in Washington by the Israeli ambassador Erdan and Secretary of State Antony Blinken?
Well, you raised an interesting question, Jerry, and just in asking for the reactions, because human rights organizations, so-called human rights organizations, have largely become political organizations in the last 20 years. However, their sort of public Western reputation is that they even are used as constituent pieces of evidence, even in court, not to mention using and exploiting the media and the international diplomatic class in order to score political points. So I use that as a preface, as to say that the American administration read or recorded the report, affirmed that the report exists, and obviously expressed concern and so on and so forth. So if you go online and look at Human Rights Watch and this screed, a 217-page screed against the collective sovereign Jews in the Middle East, you'll see that it was picked up by almost every major newspaper and media outlet in the world. And that is the trouble that we have now with what's called human rights fare or lawfare, which is the weaponization of human rights, the cynical political exploitation of human rights, which it can actually result in this type of racist report that we saw here. Nonetheless, we did see the ambassador to the United States and the United Nations, the same person, which is Gilad Erdan. He was the Minister for Strategic Affairs and is very aware of this type of cynical approach to human rights, and obviously he issued a condemnation. And some of the great, legal authorities like Professor Gene Kantorovich, he wrote a stunning and really damning riposte to this report, and at the Kohelet Policy Forum. It is really worth taking a look at. Kohelet Policy Forum riposte to this terrible account.
There's a gentleman by the name of Hirsch Goodman, who's a former South African and on the left, who considers this report to be disingenuous. What precedents was he referring to?
Yes, that's right. You're quoting him well. He used the word disingenuous in Hershey's very well authored report. And Hirsch Goodman left South Africa because of the former apartheid regime and came to Israel. Has been very outspoken as a liberal critic of some of Israelis' housing policies east of the 67 lines. And when he said disingenuous, he meant, among other things, Jerry, that the HRW account conflates the political terror issue that exists in the West Bank and Gaza with Israel's nearly 2 million citizens, mostly of Arab Muslim descent. And so he refers to all of them as the Palestinian, he refers to all of them as the near majority of Palestinian Arabs living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, as opposed to the nearly same number of Jews. It's a ridiculous argument to claim that Israel can be considered an apartheid regime because a near majority of Palestinians populate the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, because Israeli Arabs have nothing to do, and other non-Jews like Druze and Circassians have nothing to do with Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank or Palestinian Arabs living under Hamas domination in the Gaza Strip. So you can't add them all up and just say, well, you see, there are more Arabs than Jews living in that area, because if you want to make that argument, you can say there are 350 million Arabs living in 22 Muslim Arab countries in the Middle East, and then there's only 7 million Jews. I mean, I think that would be a lot better way of looking at the imbalance. 350 million Arabs living in 22 Arab states, plus the Palestinian Authority, which is a proto-state in the West Bank, plus Gaza, which is a proto-state in Gaza. So that's basically 24 Arab states and one mini Jewish state. That's really the way to look at it, not populating your metrics just by the sort of the Black Lives Matter approach, which is Muslim Arab versus Jewish Israeli.
Seth Franzman in the Jerusalem Post suggested that perhaps what the Human Rights Watch was doing was pressing on a devastating solution, a one-state solution to the impasse between the Palestinians and Israel. What are your views?
Well, I think you raised something very interesting here, Jerry, and that is that the Human Rights Watch, the former country director for what they call Palestine and Israel, and who the author of this report is someone named Omar Shakir, who is a Stanford-trained jurist, a lawyer, but he's a Palestinian activist who was deported from Israel following a very rare decision of Israel's internationally celebrated Supreme Court, that he was working towards the dismantling of the state of Israel actively through BDS warfare and other delegitimization in the name of human rights, and as a senior member of Human Rights Watch. So much for the objective credibility of Human Rights Watch. The reason I bring that up in discussing this important question that you raise is that the discourse in the United States, especially in progressive human rights circles, which HRW represents and even leads, is that Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people should not exist. In other words, we've moved from a territorial dispute that human rights organizations had weighed in on for decades, saying, well, you know, there should be what they call a two-state solution, right? Which is a territorial solution. But what we've seen, Jerry, especially in the last decade, is a move by HRW and other so-called progressive organizations towards what they call a one-state solution, which is not really a one-state solution. It's really the destruction of the state of Israel, shrouded in this other sort of diplo speak, to make it sound something positive and potentially fruitful. But it's certainly anything but that. It really talks about destroying the one mini nation, democratic nation state of the Jewish people with a Jewish character, majority character, in the name of human rights. And that is how cynical this entire discourse has become. So there is no one state solution. I mean, in the, according to the narrative of these progressive, there are some people, by the way, on the other side that believe that you can have a solution where Israel applies its sovereignty to parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, where there is Jews live, not over all the territory, because there is already a territorial division that was agreed upon at Oslo 25 years ago, and which even people to the very far hawkish right in Israel have respect. So it looks like this progressive suggestion that there be a one-state solution, meaning the dissolution of the state of Israel is really, it's a pretext for destruction. It's not Jewish destruction. It's nothing more than that.
You're referring to progressive groups in the United States. Probably one of the most redolent examples of that was J Street providing a virtual platform to PA President Mahmoud Abbas to basically prattle this same line. In addition, you had another leftist, Peter Beinart, suggesting that it's now time for Israel to, quote, normalize relations with Hamas in the midst of renewal of rocket wars and a charter seeking the destruction of the Jewish state. How myopic and dangerous is that for American Jews in Israel?
Well, J Street is in my sense, poses a great challenge to American Jewry, because what it, Jeremy Ben-Ami, who claims to be pro-Israel, but it really uses, again, this is another Orwellian case of doublespeak, because his version of being pro-Israel is to support the HRW, recent HRW report, and others who, including his own organization, that undertakes actions that undermine the state of Israel and undermine the state of Israel's democratic decisions through its majority consensus on defending itself against terrorism. They also distance American Jews from Israel by constantly driving a wedge between Israel and the United States government. They lobby Congress against Israeli aid, against aid to Israel that would be unlinked to the political decisions that the democratic state of Israel takes for itself. It readily opposes the decisions that are taken by the vast majority of Israelis from the center, from the center left, center, and center right, which today are United Jerusalem, maintaining the Jordan Valley, and of course maintaining application of Israeli law over the Golan Heights. Those three national security consensus positions are abhorrent to J Street, and he would rather hug and kiss with Mahmoud Abbas, who calls for a jihad in Jerusalem and shedding the blood of martyrs in order to, destroy Israel and replace it with a 23rd Arab state. J Street does not hold the Palestinian side accountable. They only hold Israel accountable because they see Israel as the strong horse, and therefore, as you know, on the political left, it's a question of the perception of strength that makes you wrong. Strong is wrong, and weak is right. And I think in that measure, they do a great disservice to the highly assimilating, especially young Jews in America, who are sort of looking, for some connection. And J Street appears to be a convenient connection, but J Street actually undermines their Jewish identity rather than strengthening it.
Speaking of PA President Mahmoud Abbas, he just effectively canceled Palestinian elections originally scheduled for later this month on May 23rd. How long has he been serving in office? And quite frankly, he was elected for a term of 4 years. He's been serving for 16 years at the present time.
Correct. He's been serving for 16 years, and and I think he was quite confident that he would lose if he were to have these elections now to the Hamas. The Palestinian polls have shown over the last months that 2/3 of Palestinians want him out, and they want a new prime, and not because he's too moderate, but because he is not delivering the basic socioeconomic benefits to his own constituency, and that he's been in power too long. He's far too corrupt. There are no checks and balances in Palestinian society. It is not a democracy. And it's funny that the former administration, the Trump administration, that had called out the Palestinian Authority for being a corrupt, being a terrorist kleptocracy, which it is. I mean, they in 2020 alone, they set aside 500 million shekels for the direct stipends and pensions for young Palestinian Arabs who commit terror atrocities against Jewish civilians. And so the previous administration had the policy exactly right, and the Biden administration, unfortunately, is reversing that policy. But Mahmoud Abbas is not answering the needs of his own constituency, and they're recognizing that. Unfortunately, the United States is rewarding him with all kinds of gifts and restoring status when his own constituency is delegitimizing him. And that just shows you that the American policy is deeply flawed when it comes to the Palestinian leadership.
The Biden administration announced renewal of aid to, of all things, UNRWA. At the same time, the EU is criticizing UNRWA for basically propaganda, hatred, education of kids in their schools. Why is there a disconnect between DC and the EU district?
Well, there's always been a deep need to keep financing the civil society, especially in Gaza, and I think that the evidence has become so stark over the misuse of funds by Hamas, because Hamas are the local UNRWA representatives on the ground, that it's creating a lot of tension now between stakeholders. And I think, this is one of the reasons that the former administration stopped. They were defunding UNRWA, because we need to have alternative mechanisms in place that don't allow the status quo, that don't allow the situation to devolve on the ground, strengthen the Hamas tyranny, and weaken, disenfranchise, and otherwise threaten civil society and the average Palestinian Arab, and especially in Gaza. UNRWA is basically a corrupt bank account, and it has to be changed. And I think that the more that stakeholders know that, it creates greater tensions between them as to what really needs to be done in terms of changing the situation.
Israel has had a fourth election and has resulted in a stalemate currently. However, there has emerged another Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Israeli Arab Party, in the form of an ironic kingmaker, creating a possible ruling coalition. You and your colleague, Abu Khaled Tameh, published a report that this might be evidence of increasing normalization of the Arab-Israeli minority. What are your arguments?
Well, first of all, yes, thank you for pointing that out. Khaled Abu Tameh and I co-authored quite recently a paper comparing Mansour Abbas, who is the chairman of the United Arab List Ra'am Party, which is a party representing the Southern Islamic movement in Israel, the more moderate branch of the Islamic movement in Israel, as opposed to the Northern Islamic movement, which is far more militarized and, far more radical. In Israel, a dramatic event has taken place in the March 23rd elections, and even before, and that is, first of all, in the March 23rd elections, Mansour Abbas's won 4 seats for his Ram party, and expressed willingness to join a Netanyahu-led coalition or any other, Jewish Zionist coalition from the center or from the center right or the center left. But the dramatic quality of it, Jerry, is that they, for the first time, an Arab party, and particularly conservative Arab Islamist party, has expressed readiness to work closely, to integrate, to cooperate with a right-wing or conservative Jewish Zionist party. This is nothing short of historic, and it actually is a real slap in the face, by the way, vis-a-vis the beginning of our discussion, to the Human Rights Watch report, because it completely undermines their central thesis about Israel being an illegitimate entity, engaging in all of this nonsense that they say apartheid and persecution and so on. And there's so much persecution that for the first time in history, an Israeli Arab party is reaching out to co-nationalist, if you will, or or fellow citizens, saying we'd like to work with you. Number one, and number two, Abbas phenomenon reflects what I would call peace, the Abraham effect in Israel, which is sort of the internal effect in Israel of the Abraham Accords that had been signed in September 2020 between 4 very substantial Arab states and the state of Israel. So this by the way, further shows you how absurd the HRW position is. I would urge the viewers of this program to go to www.jcpa.org, download our report for free, because it is quite stunning, including the increasing number of conversations in Arabic that are had between Jewish members of Knesset from the political right and Mansour Abbas and his colleagues. I mean, this is the type of ethnic normalization going on in Israel. And I will mention also that my beloved wife, Ophira, pointed out to me just yesterday or this morning, even on a news report, that following the terrible tragedy up in northern Israel with 45 Jews were killed in a stampede at the Maron Lag BaOmer festival, that neighboring Arab towns were offering hospitality to the families of the victims and others who could not get out in time for Shabbat. They were opening their homes in Arab towns in Israel to these ultra-Orthodox Jews. I mean, this is a stunning development, and it is an extension of our discussion here today about the political normalization going on in Israel, between Israel's neighbors and Israel, and it's only the Palestinian leadership that has distinguished itself, in inverted commas, by isolating itself, continuing its hardline anti-Israel delegitimization messages that have actually placed it by its own doing as a bastard child of the Middle East, not only with respect to Israel, but also with respect to other Arab Muslim majority states that are making peace with Israel today. So Mahmoud Abbas, to go back to your question of a little while ago, he has an awful lot of work to do at the ripe old age of 86 if he decides to continue into his 17th year of a 4-year term that ended in 2009. And because the Palestinian Arab future hangs in the balance.
A lot of meetings this past week in Washington, D.C., between Israeli officials, including the Mossad director, concerned about the Biden administration's push for renewal of the JCPOA agreement that the Trump administration basically nixed by executive order. And the question here is, how shaky is the special relationship between the two allies, the United States and Israel, over this matter?
Well, the relationship, as you and I know, and I think many of our viewers know, between the United States and Israel is a profound one on so many different levels. On the level of values, on the level of strategic interests, on the level of intelligence, included in those strategic interests on so many levels, commercial levels, research and development levels. I mean, so many different levels, diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that the relationship would ever be in danger. We certainly can come to a political clash with this administration. I mean, many in Israel, from the prime minister on down, recognize that Joe Biden is really a friend of Israel, and has very strong feelings for Israel. However, there are a number of people in his administration that are expressly unfriendly to Israel, the kind of policy decisions that we see being reconsidered has reflected a consensus in Israel that is extremely concerned with the administration's behavior over the JCPOA. Not to mention reports that they may pay billions of dollars to return some American and British hostages, and that they actually were basically going to do a Obama 3.0 on going back to exactly to the same deal that was signed in 2015, which is a deal that is completely unacceptable. Unacceptable to Israel, and a direct existential threat to Israel.
Given spikes in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and the EU, can we expect a growing aliyah to Israel in the COVID-19 post-pandemic era?
I don't know what the aliyah numbers have been over the last year, because I do know that the aliyah process, or the process of immigration in Israel, has become very, 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 very difficult because of the pandemic. But I would say that in Europe and the United States, that from the West, immigration numbers would go up. Not least of which, for the other reasons, is that economically, the administration is looking at nearly unprecedented tax hikes for many Americans, stemming from capital gains. That, combined with really an upsurge, not in right-wing anti-Semitism, but in radical left-wing anti-Semitism, which has basically taken the Jewish state as an excuse and a tool by which to attack individual Jews. I think that unfortunately, the discourse in the West has not recognized enough that the major threat to Jews stems from their opposition to the Jewish state, and their delegitimization of the Jewish state, the demonization of the Jewish state, which, according to the American discourse, is still called, no matter how horrendous it is, it's still called political criticism. It's not defined as anti-Semitism. And you can find the argument over the updated IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and the so-called progressive and even radical refusal to accept that definition as proof that in certain circles on the far left, they don't accept this notion of political anti-Semitism, which is how former Professor Bernard Lewis called it, the greatest Western authority on Islam in the Near East. He called it political anti-Semitism. That is the discussion, Jerry, that we should have on this program and other programs as to why political phobia is Israelophobia, like Judeophobia, like the counterpart to Islamophobia. And it has to be considered as completely as the collective form of anti-Semitism. Until that happens, things will get far worse before they have a chance of getting better.
How would you rate Israel's attack on the COVID-19 pandemic against other industrialized countries?
Well, I think ultimately Prime Minister Netanyahu made a strategic decision to pay premium to vaccinate all between 9.5 million Israelis, Jews, Arabs, Christians, everyone together equally, and we were almost the entire country, 75% of the entire country is now vaccinated. This is the best result in the world of any country, and I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu understood that Israel was really an R&D. We were an R&D case study for Pfizer, and I think that's one of the reasons that we went very quickly in a very well managed, almost military operation to get every man, woman, and child over the age of 12 vaccinated. Countries like the United States that are federal systems have a built-in difficulty because of the different local, state, and national federal power centers that compete for authority and that compete for public policy decisions. Israel didn't really have that problem, and central decisions were made by the federal or national government, and they were implemented. So I think we did quite well, notwithstanding the terrible coalition government we had, which was dysfunctional, and this is pre-March 23rd. But nonetheless, ultimately, the vaccination policy was very well conceived and very well executed in the end, after a very difficult year, not only for us but for the entire world. So I would, if you look at it from here at the end point going backwards, I think ultimately we get probably an 8.5 or a 9 out of 10. If you had asked me 8 months ago, it would have been like a 6.5 out of 10.
One final question, a quick one. This past week, it was announced that Israel is now part of the group of 20 nations with significant per capita gross domestic product. How was that achieved? And what remains to be done in terms of fostering normalization activities for employment, education in minority Jewish, Arab, and other in Israel?
Well, I think one of the success Israel has had is clearly in the high-tech sector, which is intellectual property, high technology, medium technology, which has really boosted our GDP tremendously. The number of companies that have financing and gone public, with very, very low cost of goods has been tremendous. Israel's GDP per capita has risen very substantially over the last 5 years, and I think that one of the fiscal issues is that the limits on credit, getting consumer credit, have been such that Israel has protected its economy very well especially during crisis times. So we still have a longer way to go in order to keep. But we are, in addition to the high technology, medium technology, we have found gas, and so we're becoming a gas exporter to Europe and to the East. So this is also something very fortunate for us. Our labor costs are lower than Western Europe and the United States. So you put all that together and you put the constant ingenuity, Startup Nation approach the business, and we should keep growing, God willing, assuming there are no more black swan events.
I want to thank you, Dan, for this on-the-road interview, and we will be back to you with other matters of import. Thank you again for this.
Thank you ever so much, Jerry. Please pardon the on the road, but it's a good way of putting it. It was an on-the-road event, on-the-road discussion, but very interesting. Thank you for these steering and penetrating questions, and I look forward to being on your program again soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.